Hey, this video here is about the big question. People ask me this all the time. What is the best lens for travel and for documentary photography?
Hey, I'm Mitchell. For the past decade, I've been living my dream, journeying around the world as a professional travel photographer. During this time, I've seen and I've learned a lot. And now I want to share the knowledge with you. Come along on the journey.
Okay, so I've actually been trying to make this video for quite a while, but I've grown really frustrated because I haven't been able to find a single place where I could record the whole video in one go, and that the place would be quiet enough to allow me to do this. So I thought, the hell with it. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna record this video in parts from wherever I am and wherever it's quiet enough. Right now I am by a lake in a quiet spot. The lake is called La Laguna Negra, translates to the Black Lake, and it's in the mountains of Colombia. Now, if you've watched my video about not being a photo sniper a few months back, you might be wondering, what the hell is this guy doing in Colombia now when just a few months back he was going towards Mongolia? And I have a little explanation to make. When it is warm enough over in that part of the world, I will be journeying towards Mongolia, but I decided to do two journeys. So when it's too cold, when it's winter time, not crazy about the winter, I'll be traveling through the continent of South America. And then when it's warm enough over there again, I'll be going towards Mongolia yet again. By the way, this here is my ride for South America. Not quite the mobile home and office that I'm using for the Mongolia journey, but I have fitted a rooftop tent onto it for some unexpected stopovers. Well, that segment by the lake was a little short. The lake is at 3,500 meters, so it was just too damn cold to keep filming there. Right now, I am in a hotel. It's more like a little two-story house actually, with a fireplace, and the views are very decent as well. This place is located just outside of a quiet little village called Iza, also in the mountains of Colombia. So, what's the best lens? Of course, this is highly subjective and depends on the kind of travel photography that you plan to be doing. Also, I think that a single lens is way too limiting, but let's say that I could only take one lens on a journey with me. What would that lens be? I'm going to tell you shortly. What's important to note is that throughout my career I have used predominantly two different systems, and the lens is not the same on both systems, so they're actually two different lenses. As you keep watching this, it'll all make sense, I promise. When I started my photographic journey, I photographed a lot of stuff like this. Portraits with shallow depth of field was something I regularly shot, some street scenes, definitely a lot of daily life stuff, and a lot of action happening. Often I needed to go from close-up to wide, or vice versa. There was also an occasional landscape, every now and then. I wanted a lens which would be as versatile as possible. The rational choice for that would be a zoom lens. Now, most of my early work was shot on Canon full-frame DSLRs, so the ideal lens for me was the Canon 24-70 f2.8. All of these images were shot with that lens on full-frame Canon cameras. Very quick plug. The versatility of this 24-70mm lens helped me capture 3 photographs from my award-winning portfolio in the Travel Photographer of the Year competition. If you want what I'd call a blueprint to making award-winning photographs, I have a very thorough, in-depth, behind-the-scenes course. There's a link to it on the screen now, as well as in the description below. So what's great about this type of lens? I say type of lens because other camera brands make the same or very similar types of lenses to the Canon 24-70 f2.8. I've listed the best lenses of this type and I've linked to them in the description below. Anyway, the first great thing about this lens is that it's a zoom, and its zoom range is actually incredibly versatile. A look at the specs in most of my work shot with the full-frame DSLRs reveals that most of it was shot between the focal lengths of 24 to 17 millimeters. Another thing that's great, the aperture is f2.8. That is as wide as a full-frame camera zoom will open up. In practical terms, this means that I can get very shallow depth of field. For me, that's most useful in portraits. A more open iris also means that you can use the lens in low light. The last thing, the aperture is fixed. As I zoom in, the f-stop value remains the same. The lens retains its shallow depth of field and its low light capabilities. What's not so great about this lens? The first thing is specific to the Canon version of this lens that I used, and this is still the case with the current version. There is no in-lens stabilization. Now, the Canon and other full-frame sensor version of this lens are pretty heavy and bulky. Just look at the specs. As a result, they're not that easy to hold totally still. If you don't have in-lens stabilization and no in-camera stabilization and you're shooting with a heavy lens, what happens? It is very easy to get camera shake blur at slower shutter speeds. This can be incredibly frustrating. Imagine you think you got a great portrait and then you'll have a closer look and you see that it's quite soft. Continuing with the heavy and bulky factor. Most full-frame cameras are not small and discreet. Add a heavy lens to one and you have virtually no chance of being candid. Now, this might not matter to some, but it does matter a lot to me. Quick story. I was shooting with a small mirrorless camera for days in Istanbul. No one seemed to ever pay any attention to me. Then one day I decided to bring along my Canon 5D Mark III with the 24-70mm lens on it. I take it out of the bag and walk literally no more than 50 meters and I hear kids screaming in the back, "Tourist! Tourist!" Just one block up, some local wise guys stop me and say, "Please show us what you've shot in our neighborhood." Now the camera looks very professional, very noticeable, and they think that I'm a photojournalist. Turns out that this is a sensitive area and they were unhappy with how photojournalists represented them before. So this lack of discreetness, the heavy weight, the fact that I wouldn't want to drag this camera around with me all day, these were big enough factors for me to want to switch to a lighter system.
Well, I did really love staying in that house, but it just got really noisy, had to stop yesterday. Dogs barking, cows, guests coming and going. Like I said, it's very hard to find a place which is quiet for long enough. So right now, it's morning time and I am above the hotel in a little foresty part. Let's see how I go here. Now, as my photography evolved, I wanted a camera that I could have with me everywhere and all the time. These days I shoot with the Panasonic Lumix Micro Four Thirds system. Very quick disclaimer, I am a Panasonic Lumix ambassador. I became one because I love their system and the lenses are a big part of that. I'm not going to try to convert you by any means, I'm just being transparent and upfront. Back to the lenses, would I choose the 24-70mm equivalent on the Micro Four Thirds system? No, I wouldn't, and there are a few reasons behind that. There's a ×2 crop factor with the Micro Four Thirds system. This means that on the Micro Four Thirds system, the 24-70mm equivalent is actually 12-35mm. Pretty weird focal length if you've been a full frame user most of the time, but that's not the big deal. That's just a way in which manufacturers adapt to the smaller sensor. What is a big deal is the crop factor in relation to aperture and zoom lenses. On the Micro Four Thirds systems, none of the zoom lenses have aperture value that goes below f2.8. Now, the crop factor means that you have to multiply f2.8 by 2 also, so the images you shoot with the lens wide open will actually look like f5.6. In other words, you cannot get that really shallow depth of field effect. The Micro Four Thirds sensor plays a role in low light performance too. I do sometimes shoot at pretty high ISOs and get good results, but I can't go anywhere near as high on the ISO as with the newer full frame sensor cameras, or even some of the APS-C type sensors. This here is probably around the limit before things get too grainy on a Micro Four Thirds system. So the 24-70mm equivalent on the Micro Four Thirds system is still a great lens. It's a versatile lens. It can still help you create images in a lot of different situations, as you are seeing. However, it wouldn't be my first choice. What about other smaller sensor systems, cropped sensors like the APS-C? With them, the crop factor is 1.5 or 1.6 rather than 2. You will get shallower depth of field, but still not as shallow as on the full frame sensors. And as far as low light performance, well, you're going to get something between the Micro Four Thirds and the full frame sensors. I've also listed and I've linked to the 24-70mm equivalent lenses for the cropped sensors in the description below. Small favor to ask you, if you do decide to buy any of these lenses online, please use those links below. It'll cost you exactly the same, but the small commission that I get will really help this YouTube channel. Okay, I'm gonna have to go and pack up now to check out of the hotel, and I'm gonna pick up this video from somewhere else.
I'm above a wonderful little village called Mongi, obviously also in Colombia. Been doing a couple of projects here, not surprisingly, with a smaller mirrorless body and a smaller lens. I'll tell you all about my setup, why I think it's great, and of course, what's the best lens for it. To me, the weight and the discreetness of a camera body are absolutely huge factors which open up a lot of different opportunities. When you consider these, then the weight and the discreetness of a lens become very important too. There is one other reason behind why I'm not that crazy about the 24 to 70mm equivalent on the Micro Four Thirds system. It's the lens's size. While, as you can see, it is considerably smaller than the full frame versions of this lens, and there is a slight chance that you won't really get noticed with it, which was the case with the photos you're seeing, it just doesn't go that well with a small lightweight and the discreet factor that attracted me to the Micro Four Thirds system in the first place. On a camera like this, which is my camera of choice, the lens is bigger than the camera itself. It just doesn't feel right. So what's the right lens then for this kind of camera system? Before we get to that, I want to show you in photos what the benefits of a smaller camera and a smaller lens look like. With these photos, there's some spontaneity about them. For example, something like this I would have never captured with a DSLR. I wouldn't have brought a DSLR to the beach because I came to look for a fisherman to buy fish from. But a smaller camera and a smaller lens, not a problem. Of course, moments happen all the time, and having a camera with you all the time allows you to take advantage. There's also definitely a more candid feel to the images shot with a smaller body and a smaller lens. People just don't pay as much attention to it. You can see in these photos, people are just going about their lives. Of course, you can achieve this with a larger camera too. But it's always harder, more problematic. I remember that with my larger DSLR, I'd often have to tell people, please don't look at me, don't look at the camera, pretend that I'm not here. Basically, with a smaller setup, you can shoot more comfortably without breaking up the dynamics of what's happening in front of you. This is especially useful when there's human interaction in the scene, during the more intimate moments, ceremonies, or in places of worship. So what type of lens is responsible for everything that I've mentioned and all the images that you've just seen? The 30mm or the 35mm equivalent prime lenses. Now, the first thing you probably think is, but it's a prime lens, it's so limiting. And that is true to an extent, it is limiting. Certainly, it doesn't have the focal length range of a zoom. After I shot with a 24 to 70mm on my full frame Canon DSLRs for so long, I thought that I would never go back to a prime, unless we're talking about specialty lenses. The turning point was a trip to Mauritania. During that trip, I extensively used what was my first mirrorless camera, the Fuji X100S. It had the equivalent to a 35mm f2 fixed lens on it. All the photos you are seeing now were shot with that lens. And you can see that there's still a pretty wide range of subject matter. In fact, for most part, I felt like I didn't miss a beat. I was really happy with this sort of setup. When I moved to the Lumix system, I tried to more or less replicate it. And the first lens that I got was the Olympus f1.8 17mm or the 34mm equivalent on a full frame system. Olympus makes Micro Four Thirds lenses too, and they're great. On the screen now are just some of the images that I shot with this lens. There's another factor that makes these lenses great. Some believe that the 30 or 35mm focal length is the closest to how our eyes see. And while you can't get photos with really shallow depth of field with this lens, there's also no really noticeable lens distortion. Now add this to the fact that you can get closer without being too intrusive, that you can be more candid, and what you end up with are photos with a certain sense of intimacy and realness to them. What lens do I use these days? Since I am a Panasonic Lumix ambassador, I use this Panasonic Leica Lumix 15mm or 30mm equivalent f1.7. It is very similar to the Olympus, just slightly better in low light and slightly more useful indoors because it is a little bit wider. You've already seen some of the photos that I shot with this lens. Here are some more. As you see, I've shot street, everyday scenes, environmental portraits, and even the odd landscape every now and then. So while the focal length might be perceived as limited, you can actually use this lens for quite a wide range of subject matter. Conclusion: the best travel and documentary photography lens for the full frame system is the 24 to 70mm f2.8. Amazing versatility, possibility for really shallow depth of field, and very usable in low light. You might ask, why not the 30 or 35mm for the full frame system? Simple. The real benefit of this lens lies in the fact that it is so lightweight and so discreet. Most full frame bodies are not lightweight or discreet to begin with, apart from maybe some of the Sonys. But in general, the larger body kind of defeats the overall purpose of these kinds of lenses. The best travel documentary photography lens for the smaller sensor cameras, especially the Micro Four Thirds, the 30 or the 35mm focal range, and an aperture value as low as possible, preferably f2 or below. Small camera, small lens, and these specific focal lengths mean more candid and intimate photos. Photos that at times just feel more real, that bring you into the scene. What about the in-between APS-C type sensor cameras? Here it really depends on your preference. Do you want a camera that you can take with you all the time, that you can be discreet with, or do you want the flexibility of a larger zoom? I recently got me a Sony a6500, and the first lens I got for it is this, 20 or 35mm equivalent on the full frame. With more choices than ever before, I think that we have been spoiled a little by technology. It's inevitable to think of the trade-offs of having a certain camera and a lens versus what you could have. Now, thankfully, we are not generally limited to any one lens, and this, in my opinion, means that it makes even more sense to go for a smaller camera body and maybe a couple of lenses, and you'll basically be covered for virtually any shooting scenario that you might face. Well, that's it from me. Please share, subscribe, and thank you for watching.